In Bacon Blast, I partook more of the beer. They had beers from Ohio and Michigan and Illinois and microbreweries, and you missed that. So unfortunately, you got here after.
I hope I haven't wasted my time coming, but
No.
no, I do like a glass of beer, and it's funny. I've always worked hard. You know, I spent 20 years in business before getting involved in politics. I start work at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I think, you know, I owe myself a little treat
I
at the end of the day. But it's also, funnily enough, and kind of the press give the impression that I spend all day in the pub. It's not quite true. But in terms of connecting with the kind of voters that turned out and voted for Brexit, actually politically, it's been quite useful too.
You may or may not know, we have a standard question we ask in presidential elections in the polls. Would you like to have beer with that candidate? Now, it wasn't particularly appropriate of George W. Bush, who had quit drinking, but it is a measure of that connection to voters. Having said that, you missed that. Other than the beer, why are you here?
Because a lot of people want to hear the Brexit story, and I think it was Brexit was a huge shock for the establishment in London, an even bigger shock for the establishment in Brussels, and what I see here in America is a lot of people asking, what does Brexit mean? What does it mean for relations between the US and the UK? What does it mean for TTIP? What does it mean for foreign policy? And I think there are one or two Republicans that I've spoken to who think, well, okay, if the Brexit campaign reached the beer-drinking voters, if you like, but the guys who don't normally vote or have given up voting 20 years ago, if Brexit reached those people, how do we, as a party in the run-up to these elections, reach the same people?
But why here at the Republican National Convention? It's not a real traditional thing to have a significant foreign politician come into the sidelines of one of our conventions.
Well, I was invited. I thought I'd come along and see it. And boy, you do things on a big scale in this country, I have to say. That was my first impression yesterday. What a huge event it is.
Have you been over to the arena already?
Yeah, I was there last night. I listened to Christie speak last night, so I had a look at that. And it's one big event, isn't it?
It is a big event.
Yeah.
And we have another one next week.
Yeah, which is even bigger, I'm told.
Have the Democrats invited you to that one?
No. No, nobody. Nobody. I can't imagine why.
Let's talk a little bit about Donald Trump. First, you have been quoted as saying you had some reservations about his character, particularly commenting on, you said, I have reservations encouraging people to beat up protesters, one or two things like that.
Yeah.
What do you think of Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, the first point to make is I'm not an American. I haven't got a vote in this election. So I'm interested to hear, I want to see him speak. I want to get a feel, perhaps rather more seeing somebody in the flesh than just on the television. I'm also going to be very careful. I think a big mistake for foreign politicians to tell people how to vote and how to think. I'll tell you why I say that. Obama came to the United Kingdom during the Brexit debate, and actually I shall always be grateful, eternally grateful to Obama, because he came to our country, he was rude to us, he told us what we should do, and he led to a big Brexit bounce of several points. So thank you, Obama, for helping us to win this referendum. So the moral of the story is I shan't say at the end of this week who I think people should vote for, although I have to say I wouldn't vote for Hillary if you paid me. But her sense of entitlement kind of puts me off. Look, what Obama has done, post-Obama, people are looking for something different. And what Trump gets right, it seems to me, is he's prepared to talk about some of the issues that perhaps others find a bit awkward, a bit uncomfortable. They'd rather brush them under the carpet. And Trump's talked about those things, and that's generated a huge level of interest. My reservations were that I've been called over the top once or twice, but I think some of Donald Trump's comments are pretty out there.
And bad?
Well, I think, to say that you would ban all Muslims from coming into America, apart from being very difficult to enforce, given that what if your citizens are working overseas or they're serving in the US Army overseas and they're Muslim? I can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to get some big messages out there, some big wedge issues. He's trying to reach voters who feel frustrated, who perhaps feel a bit scared. I get what he's doing, but just occasionally the style of it makes even me wince a little bit.
Have you met him?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't.
Will you meet him this week?
Don't know. If the opportunity presents itself, of course I would, yeah.
One of the things I noted, having watched your speeches in the European Parliament and of course on television in Britain, particularly during this recent campaign, is you're pretty good at it. You speak you have an impressive way of speaking. You speak in sentences and paragraphs. Donald Trump does not exactly speak always in the same level. What advice would you give him for his big speech tomorrow night?
Well, I thought there was a speech I saw after Super Tuesday, and I watched that, and it seemed to me there was a sort of a different Donald Trump. He wasn't at quite such a high pitch. He wasn't trying quite as hard. He seemed to be sort of slightly magnanimous in victory. And I thought if that's the style that Trump's going to adopt, he's going to win over even more people. And I think something that repeated the style of that speech, rather than it's important to punch out big messages during a speech, but you can't do that for the whole of the speech.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about Barack Obama. You are not a fan of Barack Obama.
No, I'm a huge fan of Barack Obama.
Well,
without him, we wouldn't have won the referendum. I mean, he was very helpful. I'm not a fan.
You have said, and I quote, you've called him the most anti-British American there has ever been.
Well, most anti-British American president there's ever been.
Really? George Washington, who kind of broke with Britain?
Well, that's a long time ago, and I think we're going to, I think we can comfortably put that behind us now.
Okay, James Madison, because you guys burned the White House.
Yeah, I remember that, yeah, vaguely. But no, look, Obama, no. I mean, there's definitely, I felt a certain sense of resentment from Obama towards Great Britain, the United Kingdom. It was interesting when we had the oil spill, and it was BP, of course, and he just couldn't say British Petroleum enough, and I thought, yeah, you're saying something here.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. You didn't think this last visit kind of made amends? I know his first visit, he and the First Lady ruffled some feathers. I think there was a lot of criticism in the British press about the way the First Lady dressed when she met the Queen the first time.
Yeah.
You don't think they've smoothed that over in the number of visits since then?
Well, I'm sure that when they go to Buckingham Palace, they're probably quite well received. But and certainly in Downing Street, they've been well received. But no, I mean, frankly, I thought that the way that Obama behaved during his visit, during the Brexit campaign, yeah, he kind of was talking down Britain. I mean, he was telling us that we should stay part of an organisation where our parliament was overruled, our courts were overruled. He was telling us to do things that he wouldn't for a moment suggest that the American people should do. And I also think that I think the State Department, I think frankly American politics has completely misread what the European project is. Kind of when I've been to Washington, people say, oh, well, it's a bit like NAFTA, really, isn't it? No. It is a political union, and it's one that's being forged actually without the consent of almost anybody. And the big mistake, I think, is what the State Department line has been, is, well, that's okay. Provided the United Kingdom is inside the European Union, we will get a European Union that is closer to American interests. And where the truth of it is that we are very close allies, we're big trading partners, and now that we're freed from the shackles of political union, we can get on doing trade deals together, and your best ally, your best foreign policy ally in the world, is now free to act independently. So I think Washington's had this wrong for a long time.
Talk a little more about the comparisons of the Brexit movement and what's happening here, particularly with the Trump campaign. What lessons we can learn, what lessons we should avoid?
Well, I think the big one is that, capital cities, perhaps necessarily, that's where big decisions politically get made. It's where the big media operate from. And I think, perhaps right across the West, we've seen the development of a professional political class, and kind of a political class, a media class that are interchangeable, and they tend, certainly in the case of the United Kingdom over the last few years, our political class have all been to the same school, all been to the same university, all done the same degree, never had a proper job in their lives, gone straight into politics, they marry each other's sisters, and you finish up with this very narrow view of the world. And so for us, it's kind of inside the M25, which is the peripheral road around London, a whole set of attitudes and ideas that increasingly people out in the country have turned against without those at the centre noticing. And I suspect that, the Washington Beltway, the development of a political class in Washington, isn't that to some extent what the Tea Party was all about?
Well, it's an interesting, because you talked about the weddings and marrying into each other's families. You are aware that Donald Trump made sure the Clintons came to his wedding.
I know.
And the kind of the political world of the Trumps, the Clintons, the media, all there at the same thing. Why is he? How can he possibly be an outsider against the establishment when he's so inside the establishment?
But if you're a big business figure in a country like this, it makes sense as a businessman or a businesswoman to have relations with both camps, because you never know who's going to win the next election. So I get it from a commercial viewpoint. I get it. Yeah, you're right. He is very, very rich. But what we've seen in the UK is that the voters, they're not concerned where you come from, but they're concerned about whether you're genuinely talking to them and genuinely listening to them. And what I think I've seen is that blue-collar class of people, for whom life has not been very good over the last decade or two. What they don't want are politicians that sort of tap them on the head and patronise them. They want politicians who speak to them directly and understand their concerns.
I want to talk, that's a good point, I want to talk about the voters, the similarity of the voters who came to your side in the UK and the voters who seem to be propelling the Donald Trump campaign. They seem to be white, working class, more male than female. Is that kind of the way it lines up in your eyes?
Yeah, it's not as simplistic as that, obviously. Just over 30% of the black and ethnic minorities did vote for Brexit. So it isn't, absolutely as simple as that. But yeah, overwhelmingly in the United Kingdom, the traditional working classes, whether they're blue-collar industrial workers, whether they're self-employed people running small businesses, overwhelmingly, those people did vote for Brexit. And why did they do it? Well, they did it. It isn't just immigration. Immigration was a really important part of this. But actually, believing in your country, believing that you should have your own parliament that makes your own laws, actually being unashamed to be patriotic, something that, kind of Westminster has really looked down upon for many, many years.
Talk more about the moving forces that drives that electorate. Immigration, you said you kind of just walked past that pretty quick.
No, it's very important.
Major issue for us, major issue here.
Yeah, no, look, immigration is, if we were just having finished a referendum that was purely about sovereignty, that was purely about self-government, self-determination, it would have been very difficult to win that referendum. But what open-door immigration did, we've had, since the 1950s, we had a managed immigration policy into the United Kingdom. Net migration ran at about 30,000 people a year in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. So, we knew how to do this. And yeah, there were one or two difficulties, but generally, of all the countries in Europe, we had the best race relations, the best integrated levels of immigrants into our society. We had a Blair government who, quite deliberately wanted to open up the doors. But then we allowed in 8 and then 10 former communist countries. Countries that were very, very poor. Countries, in some cases, that had not made the transition to being full Western democracies. And the Blair government estimated that opening up the door to these countries would lead to an extra 13,000 people coming a year. And it was obvious to many of us that actually it would be many multiples of that. So we now have official net migration figures. If I say official figures, I'm pretty skeptical about them. I suspect they may be a lot higher, but official figures that are 10 times what those figures were for that 60-year period.
This is all legal. We draw the distinction here in our politics between legal immigration, which everyone seems to be for, and illegal. The entire Trump campaign is talking about illegal immigration.
Yeah, no, we're talking about legal. Look, the point that I kept making during this campaign was that is, or should be, a British passport. but the first two words on it are European Union. And so, our population is 65 million. Well, it's actually probably a bit higher than that, but that passport, effectively because of EU membership, is now available to 508 million people, any of whom can come to the UK. So the argument in this referendum is the only way you can control the numbers who come into your country is to leave the EU, take back control of your borders, and what people out there saw is they saw their wages being compressed, which undoubtedly they have been since about 2007. They saw their access to getting their kids at age 5 into local primary schools, getting an appointment with their local doctor, getting people onto the housing ladder. So things that the last 2 or 3 generations had taken for granted as being the normal things that you would expect to do in life, suddenly their kids and grandkids are finding it much harder.
In this immigration thing, which is similar, not exactly the same in your country and ours,
Yeah.
a lot of talk about Muslims, particularly from the Middle East. I believe you at first talked about Muslims, then we should let them in, and then change it to it should be mostly Christians, particularly from Syria. Is that correct?
No. I mean, what I talked about was who qualifies as a refugee, and it's pretty obvious that the tiny Christian population in countries like Iraq and Syria, are genuinely being persecuted because of their religious belief. And, we're a country that has given refuge. My family were refugees. I mean, going back 300 years, but they were French Protestants, being burnt at the stake for their beliefs. I'm sure some in Westminster would like to bring that back today. But no. We've always done that. We've always given refuge to people. What the European Union has done, and I warned about this last April and last May, they've implemented an EU common asylum policy that has drawn the boundaries of who qualifies to be a refugee stroke asylum seeker. They've drawn them so wide that it means countless millions of people can come into the European Union. And I think they've made a real mistake.
Before the full disentanglement, before you actually exercise the exit, will there be a kind of a flood of migration into the UK?
Well, there may well be.
Before that wall goes up?
Yeah, I mean, it's not going to be. Look, we are not. I had this language all through the referendum. Nigel Farage wants to pull up the drawbridge, as if we want to sort of go back 500 years and defend the White Cliffs of Dover. I don't want to pull up the drawbridge. I want to control who comes over the drawbridge. And that's why we talked in the campaign about an Australian-style point system, where it isn't just the numbers that come in that you're in control of, but you actually choose the people, whether it's by qualification, whether it's checking criminal records or whatever else it may be. Frankly, I mean, what we talked about in the Brexit campaign was being like every other normal country in the world. To come to America, to get a work permit or to settle, I would have to pass a series of tests, and that's what we voted to do. Now, there is a danger that if this Brexit process takes 2.5 years or whatever it may be from now, there is a danger that there could be a big flood of people, particularly given the mess the Eurozone is in. Greece is once again heading for some repayments that she can't possibly meet, and the Italian banking system is in a very, very perilous state. So I think the British government at some point in time is going to have to say, hang on, everybody that's come legally will have fully protected rights, but from this moment on, we're going to do things differently.
Is there any xenophobia in this, all this, both there and here?
Well, there is no xenophobia in saying we're proud to be the United Kingdom. We believe in our own parliament making our own laws, our own Supreme Court being the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong, and that we should control the numbers of people that come into the country. There is no xenophobia in that whatsoever. And I've been accused of all sorts of things. I've been accused of being, anti-European, as if I thought everybody south of Calais was simply frightful. And it's just not the case. And I worked for a French company for some years. I mean, all right, they sacked me, but I'm not bearing a grudge about it. And I'm married to a German. You see, amazing, isn't it? I'm married to a German, So no one needs to tell me about the dangers of living in a German-dominated household. You know, I get it. I get it. And my intention post-Brexit is I'm now going to be a bit freer, and I'm going to travel around Europe, and I'm going to go and join and help and work with other independence movements, because I don't just think the EU was bad for Britain, I think it's bad for the whole of the European continent.
Well, I want to ask you a little bit about that. The notion of this spreading, not necessarily from you, but from the people, and moves afoot. We were talking a little bit before we came out about people seem to be disconnecting from certain institutions, alliances. I've been talking about the conventions themselves in America may soon be out of date, partly because half the country doesn't call themselves Democrats or Republicans anymore, not to mention technology doesn't really make it necessary for us to be in this lovely city, and me enjoying the beer that you didn't get to taste. There was a report out this week from a great polling institution here, the Pew Research Center, that now a majority of Americans don't call themselves any religion. And then we have this, which in Britain and here, is this an international movement afoot to disconnect, pull back, isolate? What's going on?
Well, disconnection with politics. I mean, we're back to where I was, you know, about this development of political classes in capital cities who have a set of priorities that increasingly aren't shared by people in their own countries. I mean, what is fascinating about Brexit is that we had such a big turnout. You know, over 70% of people voted. In certain age brackets, it was nearly 90% of people that went out and voted in this referendum. So Brexit re-engaged people. I mean, people in Britain are talking about politics again. Now, whether that's a temporary phenomenon, because it was just there for this vote, whether it's going to have some lasting consequences, I think that's very difficult to say. But what I would point out is that right across the European continent, you know, there are countries whose attitudes towards being governed from Brussels are very, very similar to the British. So, I do think that we're going to see more referendums.
Would you, if there's a movement and it's international, what name would you put to it? What would you call it? It's not Brexit. Is it just exit?
European Democrats. People who want to live in democratic nation states that trade together, cooperate together. I want to be good next-door neighbours. You know, there are lots and lots of things where we need to cooperate. We're living in the same time zone. There are lots of things we need to do. But the idea that you should surrender your democratic rights to a set of institutions in Brussels is absolutely crazy. So I think I think there'll be big pressure for a referendum in Denmark, so we could get Dexit. I think there's a chance of a referendum in the Netherlands, so we could get Nexit. And who knows, if we go for Sweden, it could be Sexit, couldn't it? So
I just set that right up for you, didn't I?
You did.
What about other alliances? What about NATO? Our candidate has called it, I shouldn't say our candidate, Donald Trump has called it obsolete. Are we going to start seeing disentanglement from other alliances, like military alliances?
No, I mean, NATO's got some problems with definition. You know, it was very clear in the Cold War exactly what it was there for. It's been slightly less clear since. But do I think it's an organisation of value? Yes, I do. I just think it needs to redefine what it's there for. I also think that in terms of NATO and in terms of Anglo-American relations and foreign policy decisions, we're now in a much better position than we were before our Independence Day, which was June the 23rd, because increasingly we were seeing the European Union foreign policy developing in a way where we stopped speaking as a nation in many parts of the world. We allowed the EU to do it for us, whether that was over Iran or the Ukraine, but that was what was happening. And of course the plans for a European army, you know, very ambitious plans for a European army. Now you might say that actually whatever ambitions Mr. Juncker may have, the reality is that military spending within the EU is so small, but now that the UK is not going to be a part of that, you know, I think actually effectively the idea of a European army now diminishes. And that's good, because I think that would have been a direct threat to our relationship through NATO. So I'm very optimistic about the future.
On military, particularly in Europe, you have been quoted talking about Vladimir Putin in terms not dissimilar from Donald Trump, that you respect his abilities, you don't like him
as a person,
but,
yeah.
But you respect, yeah. And Trump has said similar things. Talk a little more about what you think of Putin.
Well, I mean, look, you know, I wouldn't want to live there, and for you as a journalist, it's not a great place to be.
Dangerous.
You know, you wouldn't last long, I'm sure. It is dangerous. Now, look, I'm not a fan of Putin, but I thought in 2013, you know, we were on the verge of getting involved in yet another Middle Eastern war, namely Syria, and I think a lot of what Putin said made us think again. I've been kind of misquoted on this. I think what the EU did with the Ukraine was a huge mistake. You know, Mr. Cameron, who's gone now, but Mr. Cameron, the biggest cheerleader of all, saying that we should take the Ukraine into the European Union, we should take the Ukraine into NATO, and effectively what we saw was an elected leader of the Ukraine, albeit a corrupt one, but an elected leader toppled by a movement to get the Ukraine to join the EU. And I think, you know, the one thing about Putin, if you think he's a bad guy, you know, don't poke him with a stick. Because if you poke him with a stick, as we did in the Ukraine, he's going to respond.
What do you think of your new government? Did you think it was the new cabinet was going to end up split between people in favor of leaving and people like a prime minister on the other side?
I mean, look, I didn't want Theresa May to become prime minister because she'd backed the Remain side. So it seemed to me, when I'm told it's okay, Nigel, she only backed Remain, she didn't really mean it. Well, you know, come on, I'd like to have seen a bit more courage. But look, she is our prime minister. I think she's made one or two inspired appointments. David Davis, who was, you know, a veteran, who was in charge of our negotiations in Brussels, and I think a guy that was a director of a big public company in the United Kingdom before being in politics, and I'm pleased with that. And the guy that will negotiate new trade deals, including coming to Washington and speaking to America, is Liam Fox, you know, a noted pro-USA kind of figure. So, look, she's taken the job. She said Brexit means Brexit. She's made some inspired appointments. I just hope that she holds faith with those 17.5 million people who, despite the whole world telling them not to do it, voted for us to have our Independence Day.
I'm going to ask a quick question, then we're going to open it up to the audience. But you think you would campaign for any Republicans in the United States? Have anyone asked you to come say a word in their district, their Senate race?
No, I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't do that. As I say, I don't think interfering in somebody else's politics directly is the right thing to do. If there are some lessons from Brexit, some lessons about engaging with people that are useful, that's great. But beyond that, it would be a mistake.
Okay, we're going to open it up for questions. Ashley and Rosie will walk around with microphones. If you raise your hand, they'll come. It's not. That doesn't look like Ashley or Rosie. I think I had a change in plan here. At any rate, they'll come to you with the microphone. Please tell us who you are and ask your question. You got one right here.
Hi, I'm David Smith of The Guardian. So you mentioned you saw Chris Christie's speech last night. What did you think of the mood as you know, he got the crowd chanting "Lock her up," and why did you say that you know, if you were a voter here, you definitely wouldn't vote for Hillary Clinton? What's your analysis of her?
Well, my analysis of Hillary Clinton is that there's almost this sort of sense of entitlement, as if that, you know, this country now has its own hereditary principle. You might as well introduce the House of Lords into Washington. No, I think there is that sense of entitlement. There is that sense that she's part of a politics that has gone and people need to move on. Look, you know, the American style of politics, the way they express themselves at this convention, and I'm sure there'll be some of the same next week, is completely different. There are no direct parallels to the way we do things back in the United Kingdom. Yeah, lock her up's quite strong stuff, isn't it? I also saw, you know, as we left and walked through the protests, which, by the way, I was expecting proper protests. They're really quite small and not very threatening at all. I was very disappointed, I really was. I've had much better protests outside my public meetings than that. But interesting, seeing some of the language displayed on those protest boards, I mean, particularly on subjects around gay marriage, etc., for which in the United Kingdom would be hate crimes. So there are some big cultural differences, and I'm here, you know, as I say, I'm here as a fascinated observer of how America does politics, but I also think there is a genuine hunger to understand how Brexit happened. And I think the real story of Brexit, I think, is this: that if the little people, the ordinary people who've completely given up with politics, who don't believe that anyone speaks for them or represents them. If you can inspire those people to go out and vote, you can change the world.
Who else has a question? Over here?
Hi, I'm Mark McKegg. I'm a delegate from Texas. And I was just wondering, Mr. Farage, the impact that UKIP had on the much larger Conservative Party and impacting its manifesto, impacting the way it campaigned and it governed. How would you say that you and UKIP were able to sort of steer the course of the Conservative Party in the governing style of the elected leadership in London?
Yeah, I mean, 25 years ago, I embarked on this because I just didn't feel that our country was headed in the right direction. I felt that the European project, which my parents had bought into as being about trade, as being about being good neighbours, I could see the political dimension, and we had a big treaty 25 years ago called the Maastricht Treaty. So I've been doing this for 25 years, and one of the big questions was, should I try and do this through UKIP, or should I do it as part of the Conservative Party and by trying to work from within? All right, so that's one of the great debates and perhaps dilemmas that I faced all those years ago. And it always seemed to me that I kept bumping into people at about the time of Maastricht, and I'd meet Tory MPs who'd say, and I'd tell them what I thought about our membership of the Union, and they said, well, we completely agree with you, Nigel. And I said, well, why don't you say so in public? Oh, well, it's all, it's all a bit difficult. I might get deselected. So frankly, I took the view, two views. One, that there was virtually nobody inside the existing political class who would genuinely fight for this issue, but that secondly, if you are somebody with a sincerely held view, the big parties generally crush it out of you or stop you from getting into a position where you can exert influence. So that's why I did it through UKIP. I have to confess, it's taken a lot more years than I thought it would to get to this conclusion, and I did really worry at times that I might go down as the patron saint of lost causes. It's taken a hell of a long time, but ultimately it was the threat that UKIP were beginning to pose to the Conservative Party. Incidentally, now we pose it to the Labour Party, perhaps in an even bigger way, because some of these big issues cross the traditional left-right divides of politics. So I would say this to you, there is absolutely no way that David Cameron would have made the promise of a referendum if it hadn't been for the threat of UKIP. And when it came to the referendum itself, it was really vital that we got Boris Johnson and Michael Gove appealing to that Conservative vote. We had figures on the left appealing to their vote. And I think what UKIP did in the referendum, again, that was crucial, was I think if anybody got those people out to vote who hadn't voted in 20 years, it was us. It was our campaigning style. So as far as I'm concerned, difficult though it's been, and if you take on the establishment, they're pretty rude to you. They don't sort of come along with a tray of gin and tonics and say, jolly well done. But I have to say, it's all been worth it.
Well, I want to ask a question without a tray of gin and tonics. Right over here. Someone's coming to you, right behind you.
Hello, Mr. Farage. Tim Stanley. I'm from the London Daily Telegraph. I know you say you're here to talk about Brexit and how that happened, but you have been to Republican and Conservative conferences before. I know you've been to CPAC in the past, and you're not going to the Democrat ones. You don't have good links with liberals in this country. I know you've said that direct comparisons are useless, but what do you think UKIP and yourself do have in common with the Republican Party? Not necessarily Trump, but with the Republican Party and the Conservative movement. What similarities do you see with UKIP, and what are the differences? Can you crystallize those for us?
Well, there are some quite big differences in terms of perhaps attitudes towards gun policy. And these are the big, and we talked about it a moment ago, these are the big cultural differences that exist between this country and our country. The similarities, well, I think there are, there have been, over the last decade or so, elements of the activist base within republicanism who see what is happening in Washington very much the same way that people like me, who were Conservative Party members in the United Kingdom, saw what was happening in Westminster. It's all about disconnect. And I would like to think that maybe what we've proven is that if you're prepared, to fight hard for what you believe in, then absolutely anything is possible. And I think there is clearly, some of the attitudes towards Washington and the disconnect that exist within America, I hear quite similar echoes of the same statements being made about Westminster and Brussels.
I think there's one over here. Well, a couple. We can go back to back.
Hi there, I'm Daniel Dale from the Toronto Star newspaper in Canada. You helped pull off something that was seen by many as wildly implausible at one point, and so has Donald Trump. When he started to rise in the Republican Party, to the forefront of this field and then to the nomination, did you say to yourself, I could have seen that coming, or was it as crazy and shocking and amazing to you as everyone else?
I'm not in the least bit surprised. Not in the least bit surprised. What Trump has done, he's taken on the establishment, well, not just in Washington, within his own party, he's taken on the establishment. And now I could see the way this guy, as I say, this is not full-throated support, but I can see the way this guy makes an argument, causes a storm, then when he gets condemned by everybody, rather than retracting, he just goes that little bit further. I've been watching this with great interest. I think I'm not surprised that he got the nomination at all. It's a bit tough to say who's going to win at this moment in time, but just maybe he will reach out to those voters, and maybe there are big similarities between those voters and some of these people who voted for Brexit. So, I think everyone's been astonished at his rise, but I suspect it's probably not over yet.
I think there's another one at the same table.
Quite tough to see, isn't it?
Thank you. Tom Leonard from the Daily Mail of London. Just a small point, maybe. You were talking about the appointments, the inspiring appointments that Theresa May has made as Prime Minister. You didn't mention Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary, who's obviously in talks at the moment with John Kerry. What do you think of his appointment?
It's great. We've got a Foreign Secretary who is going to raise Britain's profile all over the world, and at the same time, he'll also make people smile a bit too, and that can't be a bad thing in a world where we don't smile enough, perhaps. No, listen, I think it's very, very good. The three Brexiteers are in position, they've got the jobs. I know there are some who are cynically saying, if they mess it up, then she's able to say, well, it was all their fault and this was never deliverable, but I just don't take that view. I think there are three people there who are committed to this, and I just hope that we've got the courage, particularly with Brussels, to recognise just what a strong hand we've got and to play it properly. And I'm in no doubt that by 2019 we will be out of the European Union. What I question is exactly what deal we're going to get, and perhaps the ultimate Brexit test is, at the next general election, will we have back our international territorial waters? Will we have back 200 miles of the North Sea that is ours, or will we have shown ourselves to be a bit weak-kneed? And I very much hope that all of those things happen.
I can't see everywhere in the room. Any other hands up? Well,
yes, hello, Mr. Farage. Oh, I've got one here at the back. It's Paul McLeod from BuzzFeed. There was a perception on this side of the pond that seemed kind of odd when the Brexit side won, and then people like yourself stepped down. Boris Johnson stepped down from running for the prime ministership, and it kind of seemed like there was this situation where you guys won, but then you didn't want to clean up the situation afterwards and deal with the implications. And I just wanted you to address that, please.
Well, Boris Johnson is Foreign Secretary, and the other two Brexiteers are people that I share platforms with all over the country. So, as for my position, look, I was, and as I explained to the gentleman from Texas, what I've done in politics, I've done from the outside. I've tried to change opinion. I've tried to raise issues that other people didn't want to talk about. And I would like to think that with my supporters in UKIP. We've changed the political agenda. We've changed the centre of gravity of British politics. I am staying on as an MEP, as leader of a group in the European Parliament, to see this process through. And I will, as this process unfolds, I will get up in the European Parliament and make my friendly and constructive speeches that I always do there, which I've no doubt they're looking forward to enormously. So I'm doing my bit. As far as UK politics is concerned, and this procedure over the next 2.5 years, there's nothing I can do. I'm not in the governing Conservative administration. So yeah, I'm taking a bit of a step back in terms of not going on leading a political party into the next domestic set of elections. But, my motivations, I wasn't one of those people, who went from university into a research office and always wanted to be an elected politician. I never even thought about being in elected politics until I was in my 30s. I got involved in this because I had one great cause that I wanted to fight, and that was getting my country back. And that's what we've done. That's what we've done. So I'm perfectly happy with where I am.
Just to wrap up, it's got to be very, very quick.
Hi, thanks very much, both of you. My name is Ruth Sherlock. I'm from the Daily Telegraph as well. Mr. Farage, you mentioned that you criticised Obama for coming in, intervening in British politics over Brexit, but Donald Trump did the same. He came to the UK, he spoke out in support of Brexit. Do you condemn him in the same way? And secondly, very briefly, Mr. Trump's kind of rise here has also been kind of, people in white nationalist movements have been quite excited by this. And the party platform of the Republicans is kind of moving quite far to the right. Is there a concern that in this kind of nativism, some kind of dangerous trends emerge? Thank you.
Okay. All right. Look, Trump did not come to the UK on a big political, speaking tour. I think he came to the UK to look at some of his business golf interests in Scotland, and was asked a question and gave a comment. It's rather different, I think, in terms of scale and intent to what Obama did. Look, I know that since the referendum, there are one or two people who have behaved very badly towards foreign people in our country. There were one or two people behaving badly towards them before a referendum was even talked about. There are always, in any society, some elements, who loathe virtually everybody. They're few in number. There is absolutely nothing that I've ever tried to do that wants to inflame that or make it worse. Actually, I would say this to you. I think what the European Union project has done by taking away from people their democratic rights, by willfully trying to get rid of their national identities into this new supranational order that no one recognises. Why have we got Golden Dawn? Why do we have an avowedly neo-Nazi party? This is not a term of abuse. They call themselves neo-Nazi. They're proud of their neo-Nazi roots. And why are they the third biggest party now in Greece? Well, I'll tell you why. Because actually, if you take away from people their democratic rights, they will move towards the extremes of right and left in politics, or perhaps even towards violence and direct action. So I genuinely believe that getting a Europe of democratic nation states, not only will Europe guarantee through doing that it's at peace, but I think that's the way we stop real